now talking about Father Samuel Matzakelli.
Thank you, Zach, for that wonderfully nerdy introduction. Like you've heard, I'm Father Samuel Hakeem. Samuel is not my original name, though, not my birth name, not the name that my parents gave me, but rather one which was given to me when I became a Dominican. We, as the Dominican friars, we retain this practice of receiving a religious name upon entrance into the order. That's no longer a requirement. It once upon a time was a requirement. You came in, you were introduced to something new. It's like, oh, I guess that's my name now. Now it's an option, but if you choose to receive a religious name, what it is you submit 3 names to the novice master, and reasons why those 3 names, and then the novice master picks one of those 3, or if he wants to, he can pick something else. If you submit really, really bizarre and odd names, chances are he's going to give you something simple like John or Matthew or one of the other apostle names. But when it was time to enter the novitiate, I did want to receive a religious name, and I was not yet sure who I should be. But as I was getting ready to enter the novitiate, I think I actually had an application. There was a student brother who did a presentation, a student Dominican brother, who did a presentation on Samuel Matzakelli. I was inspired by the guy's life, by what he did, by where he went, by his adventurous spirit, and his willingness to just get up and go, to be with the people that he was serving, to become one with the people in a way that, that was really inspiring to a young person about to enter into this new adventure of religious life. So, Samuel was a name put on my list. It wasn't really the top name. The top name was Augustine, because I have a huge devotion to St. Augustine. I read his Confessions. It was this really inspiring thing, like most young people looking at religious life, they read Augustine's Confessions. And, it's like, yeah, now I'm going to do it because Augustine did it, and I'm going to be like Augustine. I'm nothing like Augustine at all, but I have great devotion to St. Augustine still. When I get to the novitiate, and we begin the novitiate with a week-long retreat before we receive the habit, before we receive our new religious names. And I took along with me on the retreat the Memoirs of Father Samuel Matzakelli, the stories of his missionary time here in the United States. And as I read these memoirs, I was more and more inspired by this man. I came to see in him not just an inspiration, but someone who would be a guide and a friend and a great intercessor for my religious life. So I came back from this retreat. We met with our novice master. He said, okay, well, what are your names? I said, well, the first one is Samuel, after Venerable Samuel Matzakelli. He nods his head and writes something down. Of course, at that point, he's writing down Samuel will be his name. He says, what else? What else? I said, well, there's Augustine. I said, I have a huge devotion to St. Augustine. And also, Augustine was Samuel Matzakelli's religious name. So Augustine would be my second name. Okay. I didn't really have a third name, so I said Dominic, knowing that I was not going to get the name of the founder of the Dominicans. Then I went to bed that night and said, what if I do get Dominic? What if I do? I don't want Dominic, but what if I get it? But anyway, the next day, walking to the chapel, one of the weirdest experiences in my life, walking into a chapel not knowing who I would be when I walked out. Not necessarily who I'd be, I'm still the same person, but not knowing what my name would be. Even weirder after that, after we'd received our religious names, and yes, received the name Samuel, signing into the novitiate. It's this really beautiful, ceremonious thing, signing into the novitiate, and that's when your novitiate officially begins. I remember sitting there and I say, how do I sign my name? I've never had this problem before. How do I make a cursive S to begin my name? Do I do this sort of swoopy S? Do I do just a big S? I did not try to imitate Samuel Matzakelli's handwriting because it was really, really beautiful and lavish, and I failed penmanship in 2nd grade. So I was not going to get to those heights, but really weird moment trying to sign my name. Well, fast forward a few years, I'm ordained a priest, and I begin my priestly ministry at Blessed Sacrament Parish in Madison, Wisconsin, just up the road from Benton, Wisconsin, an hour and a half up the road, but just up the road from Benton, the place where Matzakelli died, where he ended his life and where he's buried to this day. And as the years have gone by, I've formed this deeper friendship with the man. A spiritual friendship, one which transcends time and space into the communion of saints, one which has carried me very far. I'd visit his grave in times of difficulty and hardship in the parish, a week of funerals, one of a young mother and a few of other very tragic situations. Where did I go on my day off? Out to Benton, to just sit with Matzakelli, who knew suffering and pain. Days of great rejoicing, my own anniversaries of profession, ordination, the anniversary of his own profession, his birthday, his day of being born into eternal life. Time and again, back out to Benton to visit his grave. Across the road, if you will, to Cincinnati, the mound where his sisters live. Sisters who are very, very dear friends of mine, many of whom have become very close friends and continue to grow in that friendship as we work together in this mission as the Order of Preachers here in this time and place. But as I've thought about it, the more I've learned about him, the more I realize that he really is a model for evangelization. So I'd like to focus on that tonight. But to begin, a little bit of background on the man. So Matzakelli, Samuel Charles Matzakelli, was born on the feast of St. Charles Borromeo, November 4th, 1806, in Milan, Italy. He was the son of a banker and a merchant, so a fairly wealthy family, not royalty, but still fairly well off. They lived in the shadow of the great cathedral of Milan. And growing up in this environment would be very formative to Matzakelli, who, as we know later in life, as we know because we're not in one of his physical buildings, but we're on the site of one of his churches, he would go on to build many churches up and down the Mississippi. So I do believe that living in the shadow of this great cathedral was really formative to him. It's somewhat surprising, however, that Matzakelli became a Dominican. There were no Dominicans in Milan at the time. As far as we know, growing up, he had no direct contact with friars. There's an account that he probably would have seen a picture of St. Dominic in a sacristy. I believe it was even in this great cathedral. Perhaps he was somehow inspired by that picture. But it's even more surprising when we hear about what the Dominican friars were like at this time. So we're talking early 19th century. This is after the turmoil of the French Revolution and the sort of collapse of the French monarchy. This is shortly after Napoleon had conquered the Papal States. Needless to say, the church in Europe was in a bit of a turmoil. Everything was a bit up in the air, particularly for religious orders, because these religious orders, which enjoyed protection, enjoyed a certain amount of safety, and enjoyed a certain mode of life, all of that was taken away. Their buildings were confiscated. This idea of living what looks like a life of leisure, a life of prayer and study, a life of ministry toward people instead of contributing to the goods of society, if you will, the temporal goods of society, all of this had no place in the new regimes. So it was a very tumultuous time for religious life in general, and particularly for the Dominicans. And so why Matzakelli would look at all this and say, I am going to be a Dominican, was baffling, particularly to his father, Luigi. In fact, Luigi was very against his son's decision to become a Dominican. Against it, but not going to block it. He never acted against this, being a good, faithful man. He saw this as the work of the Holy Spirit, but he certainly questioned, why would you do this? I'd like to point out that his teenage rebellion was joining religious life. is not my teenage rebellion, but that's a different story for another time. So at age 17, in the year 1823, Samuel Charles Matzakelli enters the Dominican novitiate, receives the habit and the religious name Augustine, all in the city of Faenza. He completes his novitiate year and then moves to Santa Sabina in Rome. It's our great headquarters now in Rome. It's on the Aventine Hill. It's a 4th century basilica, really beautiful. Kind of a neat historic fact, in the doors of Santa Sabina is the first and oldest, not first, but the oldest surviving depiction of the crucifixion. So dating around the 3rd century, which seems a little odd, right? That our first depictions of the crucifixion would have been around the 3rd century. We have to keep in mind that this was a gruesome form of capital punishment. So to display this image, as we do today so triumphantly, to have it in the center of our churches, in our classrooms, in our homes, this is something that developed in the history of Christianity. But there at Santa Sabina, he began to study as a Dominican friar. But needless to say, the studies were a bit rocky. Superiors of the house and even superiors of the order were walking out or being replaced or actively rebelled against. There's a story of 2 of the student brothers trying to poison their student master because he was too harsh on them, telling them that they couldn't just go out on their own, they couldn't eat what they wanted, they had to live this religious life. Again, crazy times in the order, times that I'm happy we do not live today. But his father in 1825, when Matzakelli was still 18, asked that a portrait be painted of his son. Wrote to his son and said, "I need a portrait of you." "Why, Dad, do you want a portrait of me?" "I need a portrait of you. Please find an artist. You're in Rome. Find an artist, have it commissioned, and have it painted." And so it was. This is Matzakelli at age 18. Why did Luigi ask this to be painted? It's a mystery lost in time. It's possible that he knew that his son was gearing up for some great adventure. Perhaps they had even talked about his desire to leave Europe and travel to the New World. But for whatever reason, we're fortunate that we haven't, because this is one of 2, and really the only confirmed image that we have of Samuel Matzakelli. Now it's interesting, in his letter back to his father that he included with this painting, he said, "Well, Dad, here you go. You'll find the painting enclosed. It looks just like me, although I'm a bit thinner." Now, the character in this is somewhat skeletal, so I don't know how much thinner he could have been. They said, "Because it's been so warm and beautiful, I also have a bit more color to my skin." By the way, Dad, this was really expensive, but it's your fault. You asked for it, so please send the money to this artist at this address. Lovingly, your son, Friar Samuel Matzakelli, Order of Preachers. So we're lucky to have this painting. And we still have it to this day. It exists at the mound in Cincinnati. There's a beautiful exhibit, actually, on the man, and right at the entrance is this painting. He's holding in his hand St. Augustine's City of God, fitting, given his religious name of Augustine. Interestingly, today we go by our religious name, so publicly I go by Father Samuel. But back then, perhaps because of the turmoil of the order, he never really seemed to go by Augustine, but always went by Samuel, both back in Europe as well as in the New World. So, rewind a bit to 1823. Matzakelli is a novice, and the Dominican Bishop Edward Dominic Fenwick, Bishop of Cincinnati, in fact the first Bishop of Cincinnati, comes across to Rome. Comes across to meet with Pope Leo XII, who had just been named Pope, as well as to meet with the heads of the Dominican order. He tells them, "I need help. Here I am in the largest and poorest diocese in the world, the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and I need help with the mission." Now, it seems odd to us today to think that there wouldn't be these lines of communication. We think how small the world feels, how easy it is to travel from one place to the next. I mean, I just drove today from Chicago to Iowa City as if it were nothing. I can look at a map and see the immensity of the US or other countries. I can look at the small, compact nature of the different countries in Europe as well. But back then, the scales of these countries were just unfathomable, especially coming from that European background. So the Archdiocese of Cincinnati at the time, of course, headquartered in Cincinnati, and went as far west as you wanted to go. There was no limit. As far north as the American border, as far south as the city of St. Louis, as far west, just as far as you wanted to go. That was his diocese. There were very few priests at the time as well, at least in that area, as the country expanded more and more to the west. So somehow, perhaps in talking to Fenwick personally, or perhaps in talking to Frederick Rees, his Vicar General, who also came with Fenwick, or maybe just through the grapevine, Samuel Matzakelli learns about this new land, the opportunities that await. He learns that it's a treacherous and adventurous place, a place that really needed help, and a place in which the weak would not survive when it came to the clergy. And so, Matzakelli agrees to go. In 1828, still a student brother of the Dominican friars, he travels across the Atlantic, lands in New York, makes his way by rail, by carriage, and by ferry to Cincinnati. He gets there and he learns English, is ordained a deacon, goes down to Kentucky to St. Rose Priory, which was the center of Dominican life at that time, and there, with Fenwick and with others, continues to prepare for the priesthood. He's ordained in 1830, and he's sent as the priest to the territory of Michigan, which again started in modern-day Michigan and went as far west as he wanted to go. So he goes all the way to the north and begins his priestly ministry on Mackinac Island. Forgot to flip the slide. Here's a picture of Fenwick, drawing of Fenwick serving the native peoples in this new land before going back to beg for missionaries. But yes, so there's Matzakelli, all the way up to the island of Mackinac Island. There were French-Canadian fur traders that would come to the island and meet with the native peoples to do their business there. Unfortunately, often doing their business in whiskey and not so much in goods that would support the native peoples. Matzakelli saw this as a terrible thing and got to work working against this, upholding the dignity of the native peoples, and working for their good, calling the French Canadians to holiness as well, receiving many converts as he did. As time went on, his ministry would move from Mackinac Island across with modern-day Wisconsin, moving down to Green Bay, and then eventually down south and west to the Dubuque and Galena and Cincinnati area. It's there that he would spend the later half of his time as a Dominican in the United States, and as I said, there in Benton, Wisconsin, that he eventually would die. As he went, though, he served mainly in Wisconsin the native peoples, so the people of the tribes of the Menominee, the Winnebago, and the Ottawa, and down in Dubuque and Galena, it was more the lead miners, Irish lead miners who had settled in the area. Along the way, both north and south, a fair mix of French Canadians and Germans as well. So a very Catholic area, as we know. We're in that area right now, and lots of ministry to do. After settling in Dubuque, he begins, or Galena really, he begins to move up and down the Mississippi River, building churches as he went. That's interesting. We'll talk about this a little later. It's interesting that he got into this business of church architecture. As far as we know, he had no training, no formal training whatsoever in architecture, church or otherwise. He just sort of seemed to pick it up on the fly, and it's somewhat miraculous what he was able to do. few of his churches still stand today and are used actively as parish churches. As we know, there was one right here on the site. We'll hear more about it a little later in the tour. So, why a model for evangelization? There are many, many different things we could talk about. I don't want to keep you here all night, though. I could keep you here all night, so I won't do that. But I want to start with perhaps the most important thing, his adventurous spirit. So the closing paragraph, or closing lines of the first chapter of his memoirs, which are sort of a thesis statement on why go at all, read as follows. Let us rouse ourselves then, and let us open the eyes of evangelical charity. And if we are called, let us direct our steps wherever the work is great and difficult, but where also, with the help of him who sent us, we shall open the ways for the gospel, and where through him our labors and fatigues will meet with success, according to the certain word of St. Paul, I have planted, Apollo watered, but God gave the increase. Right off the bat, he sees his mission, his purpose in going, as one which is going to involve adventure, one which has been ordained by the Holy Spirit. I love reading in his memoirs, though, this transition from a upper-class, fairly wealthy, spoiled boy to a true frontiersman. He writes about his first journey on horseback. I believe it was from Cincinnati down to Kentucky, a day on horseback, which put him in bed for 2 days following. He was so sore, so beat up from riding a horse, that for 2 days following it, he stays in bed. The parts of missionary life, or frontier life, in his memoirs read like an adventure. His experience encounter with snowshoes there in Wisconsin. During this visit to Abercrombie, which was across the bay from Mackinac Island, so once the bay froze up, they were able to cross. In the beginning of December of 1832, there was a snowfall to the depth of 2 feet. And when our missionary, Matzakelli, was ready to return to Mackinac, it was necessary to learn to travel with an additional pair of shoes called snowshoes. These consist of a network of about 1.5 feet wide and 2 feet long woven cord, stretched tightly over an oval-shaped wooden rim, terminating at the heel in a point. One desiring to travel easily over deep snow without sinking into it fastened these frames or snowshoes under his ordinary shoes. He talks about the difficulty of learning how to walk on those snowshoes and eventually getting it down and able to walk very, very far with these new techniques that he's learned. Talks about different encounters with wildlife, crossing the river, the canoe, the St. Mary's River, in fact, with 2 native peoples. They come across a bear swimming across the river. One of the Indians takes his knife, fastens it to a pole. He's got dinner in mind. They wait for the bear to land, take out the bear. A couple hours later, he writes, "We're eating the feast that we were watching cross a river." There's this little comedy to this whole scene, especially for a man who grew up in this noble society, of living this frontier life. Talks about a similar experience with crossing the Mississippi River at Prairie du Chien with a buck that was taken out by wolves. Had freshly been killed, the wolves were munching away. What did they do? They chased the wolves off and stole their kill and enjoyed it themselves. He talks about rattlesnakes. This too is a brand new thing. Apparently rattlesnakes, they exist in every single state in the United States, are somewhat rare, especially in Italy, in Europe. There was once he woke up, he was in a hut, a lodge, and there was a rattlesnake wrapped around a pillar above his head. Very calmly says, one morning, just as he opened his eyes, he always talks in the third person, by the way, in his memoirs. One morning, just as he opened his eyes, at daylight, he discovered one of these rattlesnakes coiled around a beam which crossed the lodge. Knowing that these creatures do not attack unless bothered, he waited quietly until it crawled out through a hole in the side. This Samuel would not have reacted that way. Growing up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains, where rattlesnakes as well are a common occurrence, it's one thing that I would call a very rational fear. Others would call an irrational fear of snakes. So had this been me, I probably would have just died right then and there. There's another time, he was sitting on the floor next to a sick man, a rattlesnake. He points out an enormous rattlesnake. Found the warmth under his cassock quite inviting. Enters in, curls up under his feet. Was discovered when he stood up to leave. There was once, crossing I think it was actually the Wisconsin River, the canoe sprung a leak. They very nearly drowned. He quickly learned how to swim that day. In all of this, through all of these adventures, one of my favorites personally, wearing a big white habit, talks about mud season, which you all know quite well. Mud season in northern Wisconsin, which is not very friendly to white habits. So much so that when he founded his sisters at Cincinnati, Dominican sisters, this white habit is the habit of the Dominicans, he put them in black habits, saying white is completely impractical in this here land. You will wear black. And they did for the first couple years. Then in order to identify as Dominicans, they eventually switched to white, probably after the creation of some sort of cleaning solution or bleach or maybe road paving. But through all of this, he never complained about the difficulties of life on the frontier. He wrote about it with excitement. He approached each day as a new adventure. And why is that important for us? Well, evangelization is an adventurous task. It's unlikely that any of us are going to set out to go to some foreign land. It's unlikely that any of us are going to, for the sake of the gospel, find rattlesnakes curled up underneath our clothing. However, evangelization, the task of spreading the gospel, does often put us in situations that might be a little bit difficult, that might stretch who we are, might call us to a new mode of being that's not where we are originally from, or how we like to act or feel, or whatever it might be. We have an option when it comes to this. We can choose to sort of cower down, run away, run back to the safety of the church, and just say, okay, well, I'm just going to stay here. It's good enough that I'm Catholic, right? I'm here, I'm praying, this is awesome, and yay, I love God, I love my Catholic friends, and I'm good. Well, keep in mind what Jesus commanded. Go, therefore, and make disciples. We're not going to find disciples to be made here in the walls of the church. So we too are called to go out. We too are called to bravely go out, adventurously go forth, and make disciples. Samuel Matzakelli was a deeply relational person. Relationships marked his approach to evangelization. As I said, I was inspired by this from a very early point in the order when I first got to know this man. How, regardless of who he was with or where he was, he just sort of dove in, became one with the people. He got to know them. He visited them at their houses. Oftentimes, he was celebrating Mass in their houses, given the lack of churches. He learned the languages. We know he only knew Italian when he came over. He learned English here in the United States. He was assigned to a French-speaking region on Mackinac Island. Okay, guess I'll learn French. He meets the Winnebago tribe, realizes they have absolutely nothing in their own language when it comes to the faith. Okay, I'll learn a little bit of Winnebago. I'll learn the main prayers, the responses to the Mass itself, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Creed, the profession of faith, acts of faith, hope, and charity. He has them translated into Winnebago. In fact, it was the first book printed in Michigan, the Winnebago prayer book given to the tribe, something that they could pray along with in their own language. Perhaps the most famous story of this, though, the relational approach to ministry, when he gets down to the Dubuque area, comes across the Irish lead miners. Here's this Italian, Matzakelli, can't get much more Italian than that. But what do they call him? Father Matthew Kelly. The Irishmen turned him into an Irishman himself. You are now Father Matthew Kelly, and you will be one of us, they told him. He kind of just laughed and played along. So externally, yes, very much a man of the people. Even where there were disputes, disagreements, he too approached them in this calm and relational mode. When he got to Mackinac Island, he found a lot of opposition from a Calvinist preacher. This preacher sort of was the man of the island. He was the minister. Catholics had been off of the island since the Jesuits left at the end of the 18th century, so this was his domain. Here comes this young, spry Dominican Catholic priest, here to mess things up, at least in the eyes of this Calvinist minister. So what does he do? Well, this minister begins to preach sermons against the Catholic faith. 6, in fact, in all. What does Matzakelli do? He responds. Not directly, not in some sort of active debate or argument. You see, he knew that there was nothing that he could say or do to change this man's mind. But there were plenty who were watching, plenty who were listening, plenty who were going to see how he behaved and how he acted. So these sermons were every Sunday morning by the Calvinist minister. And who was there, front and center? Father Samuel Matzakelli. He'd sit and listen attentively, take notes. Then the following Sunday, after a whole week of thinking about it and carefully planning it out, Matzakelli would preach a response at the Catholic Church. Not one which was fiery or inflammatory, but one which sort of carefully and lovingly picked apart the argument and showed why it was incorrect. 6 sermons in all on the infallibility of the Catholic Church, on the supremacy of the Pope, on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, on confession, purgatory, the intercession of the saints, the use of holy images, and the Antichrist. If you're counting, that's more than 6. I miscounted. But each week, he would take one of these topics, he would break it down, and preach a response. And dozens of people converted because of this. He welcomed them in, knowing that it was more than just an intellectual thing. Sure, here's where the error is, but also it doesn't end there. Why do these things matter? They matter because they build us up as the body of Christ. This relational approach was not just internal or external, however. It wasn't just how he approached serving others. He was also a very relational man internally as well, personally. So Bishop Fenwick, there on the left, and Bishop Loris, the first Bishop of Dubuque, were 2 of his closest friends. It wasn't that he was hobnobbing with bishops, it was that they were the only other priests in the area for much of his active ministerial life. But he writes about them with deep affection. He mourns over the death of Bishop Fenwick, the fact that he had to be so far away from his friend. He and Loris were together, right here in this area, building up the church, and adventurously together tackled this prospect. He writes about the first time that he was able to go to confession after months of being away from the sacrament, confessing to a priest who then confessed to him, this really beautiful moment of grace and mercy, being hundreds and hundreds of miles away from each other and being the closest priests in that region. I'd like to think that a lot of this was his Dominican background. We are an intensely communal order, and even though he did not have community during most of his life here in the U.S., the seeds of that community would have been planted somewhere within. He would have known the stories of the great friends of Thomas Aquinas and Henry, his scribe, who was more than just a co-worker. He would have known the stories of St. Dominic himself and Bishop Diego, best friends who set out to found this order of preachers together. the story of Blessed Jordan of Saxony and his good friend Henry, his other friend, Blessed Diana, the nun. Yes, he was a man of deep love, deep friendship that carried him far. His first sisters there in Cincinnati were friends as well. Together, they formed this new reality. Friendship, as we know, is key to evangelization. We can't expect to do this alone. What are we bringing people into? Is it just this sort of cold and distant idea of truth? Do we bring people in because we're supposed to? Or do we bring them into the body of Christ, into relationship, into friendship with God and God's people? The strongest thing that we can have to witness the goodness of our faith is how we treat one another. The strongest need right now, we know this so well in the world, is relationship, is friendship. Now, it's tempting to think that, I can't be friends with someone unless I share everything in common with them. Now, let's get them Catholic first, and then I'll look at making them my friend. The exact opposite is true. How can we expect to bring someone along in their relationship with Christ? How can we expect to care for someone's salvation if we don't first love them? This is messy work. It's hard work. Samuel Matzakelli knew it very well. We all probably know it as well from our own experiences. But how essential is friendship, the gift of evangelization? Matzakelli was also very attentive to the Holy Spirit's work in the world. There were lots of things that had come before him. I mentioned the Jesuits had been there before he got there. They were sort of the first evangelizers of northern Michigan. Marquette, of course, his name is sort of heralded there on the Upper Peninsula, the town of Marquette, the Diocese of Marquette. But it had been years and years and years since these people had seen a priest. And the priests that they knew were Jesuits. So with that in mind, probably because of the messiness of the frontier, Matzakelli didn't often wear his white habit. Rather decided to go with the black cassock, something a little bit more identifiable as priest. In fact, many of the native peoples called him the Black Robe. The Black Robe became his name among the tribes. I mentioned that he had this Winnebago prayer book translated as well, very significant and important work. But even before that, he would listen to the words of the native peoples. He heard them speaking of the Great Spirit, always the Great Spirit. Use this as an entry point for the gospel. This Great Spirit, he told them, is God, the creator of everything. These other spirits that you worship, the gods of nature, are not true gods, but rather are creation of the Great Spirit. How wonderful, how beautiful is this? He appreciated the native people's attentiveness to nature, the seasons, to the things of the earth, and used that too in his ministry. And while he had varying success among some of the tribes, he had great success in these places where this landed. Now again, for us today, it's not likely that we're going to be setting out to evangelize people who have never heard of Jesus Christ. We're not setting out to some new world. But how often do we come up against people who might not have a good understanding of who God is? They understand goodness in the world, right? We hear, I'm just going to be a good person. They understand art, beauty. They understand and appreciate nature, relationship, friendship, love. These are all entrance points. These are ways in which the Holy Spirit draws us into that ministry of evangelization, if we can be attentive to it. One of the most significant things that Matzakelli has left us today are the churches that he built and the communities that he founded. Up and down the Mississippi, as I said, building churches, founding 35 faith communities in all, and building over 20 churches, some of which are still standing and in use today. Of the ones that are still standing today, you have St. Anthony's in Davenport. I don't have all of them on here, but I just wanted to go through a few of them. On the right is the original building that was built there. On the top floor was a church, on the bottom floor a school, as well as the rectory where the priest would live. On the left is the modern day St. Anthony's, the current day St. Anthony's, which has gone through a couple different iterations of being built and added on to. Now he built the one on the right and planned the one on the left. It's a little hard to tell whether or not he took part in the actual building of the current St. Anthony's Church. What's interesting though is, in his approach to building these churches, as I said, he had no formal background in architecture. He had no formal architectural training. He began building churches just sort of out of bark and mats. An old overturned canoe becomes the altar. These mats are sort of this temporary place, but a place where we can worship, a place which has some sort of dignity to it. In time, as he learns different building materials, he moves on to wood, to log churches that are easily assembled, but not very warm, not very safe. And in time, into this stone architecture, which becomes his sort of go-to. Most of his churches, which are still standing today, are built of stone, although one, St. Michael's in Galena, is built of brick. St. Anthony's in Davenport, not too far down the road. I encourage you to go take a look. There's another one in Muscatine, St. Matthias, not the current church of St. Matthias, but a much smaller church. Is it Muscatine? Am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm one of these non-Iowans, so sorry. But the old St. Matthias Church is a little 20 by 30 foot frame church, which he built in Prairie du Chien, dropped in the Mississippi River, and floated it down. They've hauled it out at Muscatine, put it onto a foundation, and that's the church there. It's still standing today. We have, speaking of Prairie du Chien, St. Gabriel's, which was the largest church that he built. He was very proud of this one. Now the facade on the front, there are big towers on the front, that was added much later. But the interior is more or less the same as when he built it. It's 100 feet long and 50 feet wide. Perfect wedding church, I would know. I got to celebrate a wedding there back in January with a dear friend of mine. But there's St. Gabriel's. And then perhaps his crown jewel. It's not the biggest church. Oh, there's one more, I'm sorry. St. Patrick's in Benton, Wisconsin, where he eventually would die. This was the altar that he built for that church. It's in a sort of back church, or back chapel in St. Patrick's. St. Patrick's is somewhere around the size of this modern day St. Mary's. A larger church, but not quite as large as St. Gabriel's. Then perhaps his crown jewel, not his biggest, but his most architecturally interesting, was St. Augustine's in New Diggings. There are lots of little features to this church that show that he was a master of architecture. I'm going to point a few of them out. So, can you tell what material this church is made of? Stone? So it looks like stone, right? It's actually wood painted with sand to appear like stone. So it's a wood frame church, but they painted it with sand. And by the way, this was recently restored, I believe in '09, by the Knights of Columbus in the Benton area, Shoalsburg, Wisconsin, actually. But yeah, painted with sand to appear as if it were stone, like the churches he knew back in Italy. The interior is very plain, very simple, although with a few ornate features. You'll notice the carpet there in the altar. Back behind the altar is not just a sacristy, it was also his rectory. He lived there for a number of years. It's a 2-room rectory, very small, very quaint, but adequate. Nice big furnace in there, a little confessional as well with an exterior door, so people could come anonymously to the back door, come on in, kneel in the confessional, and he would know he had a confession to hear. The altar is all wood, painted with gold accents so as to appear golden. This centerpiece here is actually a false piece. It's a trap door that opens up, which was perfect for storage, a building that did not have much as far as storage goes. In the basement, in the back of the rectory, 2 classrooms to be used for instruction. He used the materials that he had at his disposal and added what he could to make them dignified. Oh, I do have a close-up of the trap door there. Even this carpet and the wallpaper in the back in the rectory, or in the rectory portion of the church, were imported from Italy. Designs he would have been familiar with from his homeland. Now these are recreations. When they did the renovation of the church, they got the pattern off of the old carpet, which had been faded, which was kind of falling apart. They had it recreated to the tune of $25,000. So it cost $25,000 today to be made. Who knows what it would have been back then? Certainly not just a scale of. But he knew the importance of a dignified space. Now, none of these spaces are Baroque or ornate or incredible, but all of them do have a certain dignity, and it plays a role in evangelization. I want to read a little passage from his memoirs about the church that stood here and the effect that it had. So the original St. Mary's, which was actually the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, several converts to the faith comforted the heart of him who was striving to establish Catholic worship. Again, speaking in that third person. Among these was the mother of a family who had been baptized by total immersion 10 years before, according to the practice of the Baptists. Apparently, the total immersion baptism was an odd thing in the Catholic world during Simon Matzakelli's time. As she had read in her Bible that the priests of the Old Testament made use of sacred symbols in their worship in the temple, she argued with simplicity and with justice that the Catholic religion conforms more closely with Holy Scripture than do the sects, for they reject every sign of religion and devotion ordained by the Lord in the law of Moses and practiced by the Savior himself, while the Church, animated by a spirit of holy fervor, still manifests her living adoration of the divinity by means of those holy, venerable rites that have accompanied the sacrifices and prayers of the patriarchs, prophets, and all of the just from the beginning of the world. So we saw this need to build churches and dignified spaces as something key to his ministry, evangelization. As we hear, it did lead to conversions. How often do we hear stories of people walking into a church and say, wow, this is gorgeous. I mean, look at this church. I'm excited to get the tour, hear more about this beautiful space. Beauty does evangelize, but not on its own. It must point to something deeper, something richer. It must have meaning to it. Matzakelli knew this well. One final piece of that church, though, in new diggings, St. Augustine's. So this here is the back balcony, the choir loft, if you will. Now, it's a very small church, so you'll notice that there are some pews up in the choir loft on this side. If you look closely, it's a little hard to tell. It actually just looks like the picture is crooked or maybe off-centered. But the floor of the balcony, where the pews are, is pitched. On the other side, this side here, is flat. The place where the choir would have stood and sung from is flat. The place where the congregation would have sat and needed to see is pitched. How he was able to do this with no architectural training, with no modern instrumentation, back in the mid-19th century, is baffling. It's made from 2 timbers. There's one big beam here, and then another big beam on this side. Is it possible that he saw this tree that had a natural twist in it and said, you know, I know where that needs to go. I have a perfect use for that. whatever it was, whatever his genius was, or his learning along the way, this church still stands, has been recently restored. It's not used every Sunday, but is in beautiful condition. Matzakelli was also deeply involved in society. That building should be familiar to you all. Did you know he played a part in designing it? The dome and I heard the reverse spiral staircase as well. You might not hear that on the tour, but he had a part to play. These are street signs from Shullsburg, Wisconsin, along with one of the devotees of Matzakelli. When they changed the street signs, he was able to keep them all. To this day, the streets are named after the virtues. So you have the corners of like justice and mercy, or friendship and love, wisdom and fortitude. There in old Shullsburg, what was the original city of Shullsburg in southwest Wisconsin, all the streets are named after virtues because Matzakelli laid out the city. This is a time where the church is wrestling with this new reality. Up until that time in Europe, to be Catholic was to be in control, in power. The Catholic monarchies of Europe had begun to fall, however. At the same time, you have this new project, the United States of America, a land of separation of church and state, something which was a little bit unpopular in the Catholic world to begin. But Matzakelli dove right in. He saw this as a good thing, a fortuitous thing, in fact, a place where the faith didn't depend on society, where the faith did not depend on the ruling class, but rather could be lived freely, apart from temporal rule. He knew what that temporal rule can lead to, especially when it involves the faith. He had experienced it personally with what was going on in Europe. He saw this as an intriguing, good, new idea. For us, it's easy to sort of walk away, right? To think, well, I have no part to play. I shouldn't really be involved in society. We never really hear about the Catholic vote, do we? We hear about the evangelical vote. We hear about these other votes. Well, what's our role to play in society? Especially you all as laity. You have a role to play in evangelizing culture, in shaping culture through your Catholic faith. Are we able to do this? Are we willing to do this? This is the call of evangelization. Sometimes faith calls us to go to difficult places, though. He wrote in staunch defense of the native peoples when they were being removed from their lands. This is a draft of a letter. This exists out at the Mound. It's a draft of a letter written to Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, against the move of the native peoples off of their lands. He also wrote, Abraham Lincoln called for a day of victory to be preached after the Civil War. Matzakelli was having none of it. He was not out to preach a day of victory, rather preached a fierce and fiery sermon, the evils of war, the difficulties, the sadness, the pain of brother killing brother there on the battlefields of the Civil War. So yes, our faith challenges us to be involved in society. There's a way in which Matzakelli was a master at managing difficulties and disappointments. We know he had a great devotion to our Sorrowful Mother. You'll often see in his old churches images or statues of the Sorrowful Mother, and this ties into his personal devotion. He had a small icon of her that he kept in his priory, in his small house, I should say, his rectory. There's a statue of her. He went back to Italy about halfway through his time in the U.S., really to write his memoirs and to gain funds to finance the missions. He saw a statue when he was with another Dominican, Henry Lacordaire, big name in France, in the French, post-French Revolution, the way that the order resurrects itself there in France. He says, I really do love that statue, and it would be great in one of my churches in the New World. So Matzakelli leaves, eventually comes back to the U.S. At some point in time, a crate shows up. The only thing written on the crate is S. Matzakelli, USA. It made its way all the way to him, and inside that crate is the statue of the Sorrowful Mother. It's in Cincinnati, as they say, at the Mound to this day. with a beautiful crown gilded with special jewels inside. But this devotion to his sorrowful mother must have come from his experiences. He faced many, many, many hardships. We heard about his early days in Europe when he entered the Dominicans and how tumultuous that was. He comes across and is the only priest in these lands. The first time he tried to build a church in Green Bay, he failed miserably. Ran out of money halfway through the project, left a halfway built church well in debt. It took him years to gain the money to pay back that debt, and then I believe it was the Norbertines who bailed out the Dominicans and finished the building of that church. He tried to found a province of Dominicans in Dubuque. Now, Dubuque was supposed to be the big place. Dubuque was supposed to be the Chicago of the of the Midwest. But the railroad beat out the Mississippi, and Chicago won out, much to the chagrin of Dubuque. I wish Dubuque would have won. It's a much more beautiful place than Chicago, speaking as someone who lives in downtown Chicago. But anyway, tried to found a province of Dominicans there. Well, 4 Dominicans come over, 2 of them actually cousins of Samuel Matzakelli. They could not hack it. Frontier life was too difficult for them. One of them runs off with a woman, unfortunately, and leaves the Dominicans completely. The other ends up heading back to Italy. 2 friars from France were completely just could not handle it and ended up going back as well. Part of that, he founded a seminary. If you're going to have an order or a province of the order, you have to have a way of training your men. So he garners all of this equipment, all of these things to open a seminary, a school, and then all of a sudden, that's not needed. Well, not one to let disappointment get to him. He just shifts focus. Okay, I tried with the men. Let's try with the women. Founds his sisters, Dominican Sisters of Cincinnati, and opens the seminary no longer as a seminary, but rather as St. Clara Girls Academy in Benton. At the time, this was a revolutionary move. St. Clara Academy was just as state-of-the-art as the University of Wisconsin. I know you Hawkeyes might be saying, well, University of Wisconsin's not that state-of-the-art, but just bear with me. This is back in the 1830s. He had these scientific instruments. We have a telescope, a static electricity machine, a magnet. There's a model of the planets, the way they orbit. All of these really neat scientific things that he was bringing into the classroom with young women. So revolutionary. So instead of letting disappointment get to him, instead of letting it get him down, he just simply shifted focus. Okay, this isn't working. Let's try here. That sort of flexibility is important for us as well in evangelization. You might try certain approaches, certain activities, certain programs, but not everything is going to work. Or perhaps, I remember a Dominican, a good friend of mine. He's a couple years older than me in the order. I was talking to him about one of my own personal abysmal failures. He said, did you ever think that maybe it was God's plan to have you fail? God's plan to have me fail? I said, well, yeah. It happened, did it not? Yeah, it happened. Well, is God not all providential? Yes, so. Maybe it was God's plan to have you fail. The same goes in our evangelical lives. Not everything is going to be a success. We plant these seeds. Who knows who will come along later, water those seeds? Who knows the growth that will occur? So yes, time after time, instead of getting disgruntled or too far down, Matzakelli just shifted his focus. We'll try over here. And finally, Mazzuchelli's model for evangelization, trait of being willing to sacrifice. This here is a certificate that he wrote up for the Total Abstinence Society. So he gets to Dubuque, Irish lead miners were known for imbibing a bit, if you will. They realized that this was not good. This was it was causing a lot of trouble, obviously personally, for these men, for their families, for the community. So what does this Italian do? This Italian, who I'm sure loved his wine, he says, okay, we're going to go drive, all of us, starting with me. Feel free to join me. This is good, and this will be good. I imagine this was a huge sacrifice for him. You know, he left everything else behind, those like final few comforts of a glass of wine at night, leaving that behind as well, in order to preach the gospel, in order to lift others up. His final act as a priest was to go out and anoint someone. It's February, it's Wisconsin. He learns that someone is sick and is not going to survive the night. He leaves Benton, hops on his horse, rides through the night, anoints the man before he dies, and returns. Falls ill, pneumonia, what now we know is pneumonia, and never recovers. And on February 23rd, 1864, ends up passing away there in Benton. He was a man of great sacrifice. Any missionary is. So must we be if our word is going to be effective. He's memorialized there in Benton with a beautiful grave, recently renovated actually, and rehabbed, if you will, somewhat. They added in sidewalks and a bench. It's a beautiful little area. And there on his gravestone, in Latin, are the words of Psalm 84. I wanted to end with Psalm 84. You can tell, as I read it, why this would have been his favorite. Not only was it his favorite, as he was dying, these were his dying words. First two lines of Psalm 84, now printed on his tombstone. But here in English, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul is longing and yearning for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out to the living God. Even the sparrow finds a home, the swallow a nest for herself, in which she sets her young at your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Blessed are they who dwell in your house, forever singing your praise. Blessed the people whose strength is in you, whose heart is set on pilgrim ways. As they go through the Baca Valley, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rain covers it with pools. They walk with ever-growing strength. The God of gods will appear in Zion. O Lord, God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. Turn your eyes, O God, our shield. Look on the face of your anointed. One day within your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. The threshold of the house of God preferred to the dwellings of the wicked. For the Lord God is a sun, a shield. The Lord will give us his favor and glory. He will not withhold any good to those who walk without blame. O Lord of hosts, how blessed is the man who trusts in you. You can imagine him walking across the threshold of his churches. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. You can imagine him entering into the halls of heaven. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. Thank you. I think we have some time for questions. I don't know what the timing is, but any questions? So, the second to last real chapter in here is his encounters with Joseph Smith. Interestingly, it's one of the few non-Mormon accounts of Joseph Smith that we have. Joseph Smith would have been in Nauvoo, Illinois, right around the same time period that Matzakelli was in the States. And of course, being a religious figure with such gravitas, naturally the two would have met. He does not have nice words to share about Joseph Smith. He says he's the most arrogant and conceited man he's ever met, and some other things, and sees this movement that he has begun as a very dangerous one. So did not have very nice things to say about Joseph Smith. We only know about the one. It could have been more than one, but we only know about the one. Or he only writes about the one, I should say. Now this was written, like I said, it was about halfway through his time in the US. He goes back to Italy. He writes this as a sort of neat story about life on the frontier in order to use as a fundraising effort for the missions. So the original was in Italian. It was published in Italian. Like I said, it never mentions him by name. We know it's his because of the places he was, the time he was in those places, and the fact that he talks about building these churches, and we know these churches were built by him. But you'll notice that the title is Memoirs of a Frontier Missionary Priest. The Italian title is much, much longer than that. But yeah, throughout it just talks about the missionary. So it's possible that they met when he came, or that they continued to meet after he came back. Not friends, no. Yes? So I didn't mention this, but it was really the work of the people. So he would gather the people together. A lot of the funding came from the dioceses as they were founded and erected. But a lot of it was the offerings of the people, the sacrifices of the people to build their church. So both monetarily and in labor, he brought together the communities to build them. Some of the funding did come from Rome through the congregations and the movements of missionary activity, and apostolic funds. Yeah, much of it was just local. Some of it, believe it or not, two very interesting sources. I forget exactly where, but I think it was in Iowa, some from the state. The state said it's good that we have religion practiced and we're willing to contribute to the building of this church. And at least in one case, from the Protestant church, who saw that it was good to have people, again, practicing their faith, so contributed to the building of the Catholic Church there in town. Any other questions?
Even if he was around Bishop Lawrence, did he have an influence on any of the structures of Lawrence?
At the college? No, not at the college. The original cathedral in Dubuque was built by Samuel Matzakelli. And he also built a government building there as well, just like he did here, the old Capitol building. A lot of these buildings, unfortunately, have burnt down. Those of you who have been in Iowa City know that story with the old Capitol. But some of them burnt down, some of them were dismantled to build larger churches in that same place. And a few of them, 5 in all, still stand today. I should mention a couple things. So he's venerable right now, which means he's on his way to sainthood, but he's not yet a saint. The thing that stands between venerable Samuel Matzakelli and blessed Samuel Matzakelli is a miracle. Now there was one submitted. There was a man who had, it was either a lung issue or a back issue. I honestly am forgetting right now. Prayed with, so Matzakelli wore a metal penance chain around his waist, a practice that would have been more normal back then. No one knew about it. In fact, they didn't know about it until his death. And had it on so long that, as you can see, this is the other picture that we have that's likely of him. It was in a composite of priest photos from the territory from back when he was there. And it's close enough to looking like him to there say, okay, it's is very likely him. As you can see, he's no longer that thin as a rail young man, but had gained a little bit of weight in his later years. So this penance chain that was around his waist was actually embedded in his flesh. He had worn it so long that it had become embedded in his flesh. They have that today in the museum in Cincinnati. And this man who was sick prayed with the penance chain. The next day began to heal at a pace which was much more rapid than medicine could have done. Now, the difficulty with healing miracles and submitting them for canonizations or beatifications is that it has to be 100% medically impossible. This goes to a team of doctors, some of whom are non-religious. They're on these teams of investigative doctors. They're people of other faiths and non-religious people. In order to get a completely unbiased opinion, is this medically feasible? In this miracle that was submitted, they said, well, there was medical intervention. So even though the cure happened at an impossibly fast rate, even though this points to the signs of miracle, because there was medical intervention, we can't accept this as the miracle. This is a huge bummer to many of us, to the Dominicans, to at least 3 bishops that have big veneration and closeness to Samuel Matzakelli, to the sisters in Cincinnati, and to thousands of Catholics up and down the Mississippi. So what this means is it's up to us to continue to ask for Samuel Matzakelli's intercession for a miracle. So if you know someone in need, especially in great need, get on the heavenly horn to this guy. A couple of resources. So I brought a bunch of prayer cards with a special prayer of beatification on the back for Matzakelli. Great things to give. Take all of these. I don't need any back. So take as many as you want. But if you're interested in learning more, there are 2 books out right now. One is his memoir. So if you just search for Samuel Matzakelli Memoirs, you'll find this. It's cheap because it's in the public domain. If you really don't want to pay for a physical copy, just find it online. The entire text is online. It's worth a read. It's very, very entertaining. It's a fun read, and it tells a lot about the places that you call home. The other one was written by Sister Mary Nona McGreal, who was a great historian of the Cincinnati Dominicans. She taught for many, many years. Nona was the one who submitted the paperwork for Matzakelli's cause, for his beatification, his canonization, etc. And it's significant because she was the first woman to submit a cause for canonization. So a very, very special thing. This book is a lot of the research that went into that, but written for normal people, not for a bunch of people in Rome reading reports that tend to be on the more boring side. So this one's called Samuel Matzakelli, American Dominican. It's also pretty widely available, but I recommend both. There's a 3rd book, hopefully coming out soon. It was written by an Italian friar, Father Massimo Mancini, and it's on Mazzuchelli's early years in the order, on his formation and his time in Italy before he came across to the U.S. It's in translation right now, and hopefully, before too long, will be in print in English. But these 2 are readily available today. I don't have copies with me, but you can find them online pretty easily. Yeah, thanks for coming.
So for the tour, if you want to stay for the tour, I encourage you to get up and stretch first because these pews get hard after a while. We're going to gather back by the baptismal font in the back of the church, so the back section of pews. If you need to go to the restroom, go downstairs, that door on the left in the back. Use the restroom before the tour. We're going to take down these things to get ready for the tour, so there will be a few minutes. The tour will be about 30 minutes long, and it will be live streamed so that you can look at it on St. Mary's YouTube channel if you're not able to stay tonight. And thank you for coming tonight.